An elderly woman was laughed at in the restaurant. Minutes later, she made the chef apologize publicly. Margaret Wilson adjusted her pearl earrings as she entered Le Maison Blanc, one of Philadelphia's most prestigious restaurants. At 73, she still carried herself with the grace she'd learned as a young ballet dancer, though arthritis had slowed her steps. Tonight marked 50 years since her late husband Thomas had proposed to her in this very restaurant. She'd made the reservation 3 months ago, requesting the same corner table where Thomas had nervously fumbled with the ring. "I have a reservation," Margaret told the young hostess. "Wilson, table for one." The hostess glanced at her tablet, her expression shifting. "Oh, Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your reservation." Margaret's heart sank. "I confirmed yesterday. I specifically requested table 17. I understand, but that table has been assigned to another party. We have a lovely spot by the kitchen." "No," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Table 17 has sentimental value. I'm celebrating an anniversary." The hostess looked uncomfortable. "Let me speak with the manager." As Margaret waited, she observed the restaurant. It had changed over the decades. More modern, less intimate. The white tablecloths remained, but the warm candlelight had been replaced with designer fixtures that cast an unflattering glow. A tall man in an expensive suit approached. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Derek Chambers, the manager. Unfortunately, table 17 has been reserved for a food critic from the Times. Perhaps you'd consider returning another evening. We could offer a complimentary meal." Margaret gripped her handbag tighter. "Young man, I made this reservation 3 months ago. Today is the 50th anniversary of my engagement. I'm not leaving without sitting at that table." Derek's smile tightened. "I understand, but surely you can appreciate our position." "And surely you can appreciate mine," Margaret countered. "Your eternity d'Antoine Friday. I've been coming here longer than you've been alive." After several tense minutes, Derek reluctantly seated Margaret at table 17, though his demeanor made it clear she wasn't welcome. As she settled in, she noticed the sideways glances from the staff. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her napkin, memories of Thomas competing with her growing discomfort. A waiter finally approached, introducing himself as Justin. "Our special tonight is pan-seared scallops with truffle risotto," he recited mechanically. "I'll have the coq au vin," Margaret said. "It's what I ordered 50 years ago." Justin paused. "I'm not sure if that's still on the menu. Let me check with the kitchen." Margaret waited nearly 20 minutes before Justin returned, informing her that the chef could prepare the dish. As he walked away, she overheard him mutter to another server, "Stubborn old lady holding up the whole service for some ancient menu item." Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation. She considered leaving but glanced down at her wedding ring. Thomas wouldn't have backed down, and neither would she. Chef Antoine Moreau slammed his palm on the stainless steel counter. "Coq au vin! That hasn't been on the menu in years!" His French accent thickened with irritation. "Who is this woman? Some old lady insisting on sitting at table 17. Justin replied. "Says it's some anniversary." Antoine rolled his eyes. "These people living in the past. This is why we can't evolve." He wiped his hands on his apron. "Fine. Make her happy, so she'll eat and leave. We have important guests tonight." In the dining room, Margaret sipped her water, trying to ignore the whisper. She'd worn her best navy dress and had her hair done at the salon. Thomas had always said blue brought out the spark in her eyes. The restaurant's playlist of ambient electronic music felt jarring compared to the classical violin quartet that had played the night of their engagement. Her mind drifted to that evening. Thomas, 25, and already showing promise at his architecture firm, had saved for months to afford dinner here. He'd been so nervous he'd knocked over his water glass, soaking the tablecloth. They'd laughed about that for years afterward. Justin returned with a glass of red wine. "Compliments of the manager," he said, without making eye contact. "Thank you," Margaret replied, though she suspected it was more to placate her than out of genuine hospitality. At the table beside her, a young couple was celebrating something, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones as they photographed each elaborate dish. The woman was wearing an engagement ring that caught the light. Margaret smiled at them, but they quickly looked away, as if her age might be contagious. In the kitchen, Antoine hastily prepared the coq au vin, muttering under his breath about outdated cuisine and demanding customers. "This is not what I trained for," he complained to his sous chef. "Oh, I studied at Le Cordon Bleu to create art, not to recreate prehistoric recipes." "Maybe it's important to her," the sous chef suggested. "Everything is important to someone," Antoine retorted. "That doesn't make it important." When the dish was ready, Antoine scrutinized it with disdain. It wasn't his best work, but it would suffice. "Take this to the old woman," he told Justin, "and tell her the chef hopes she enjoys her trip down memory lane." Justin carried the steaming plate to Margaret's table. "Your coq au vin, ma'am. The chef hopes you enjoy your evening." He'd edited Antoine's actual message, but his tone conveyed enough. Margaret looked down at the dish. It resembled the meal she remembered, but something was off. She took a bite and frowned. The sauce was too thin. The chicken overcooked. This wasn't the dish that had been served the night Thomas proposed. That meal had been crafted with care and respect. Margaret set down her fork after a few disappointing bites. The coq au vin was technically adequate, but lacked soul, something she'd never have said about the dish 50 years ago. She signaled to Justin, who approached with visible reluctance. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "I'd like to speak with the chef, please." Justin's eyes widened slightly. "The chef is very busy, ma'am. Perhaps I can help." "The chef," Margaret repeated firmly. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades as a high school principal. Justin hesitated before retreating to the kitchen. Through the service door, Margaret could see him speaking to a tall man in a white coat, who threw his hands up dramatically before removing his toque. Chef Antoine approached her table with the forced smile of someone enduring a root canal. "Oh, madame, how may I help you?" His accent seemed to thicken deliberately. "Are you the chef who prepared this coq au vin?" Margaret asked. "Oui, I am Chef Antoine Moreau. Were you the chef here 50 years ago?" Antoine laughed sharply. "No, madame. 50 years ago, I was not even born. Then you never had the privilege of learning from Chef Henri Laurent, who prepared the most extraordinary coq au vin I've ever tasted," Margaret said. "It was served the night my late husband proposed to me, right at this table." Antoine's expression hardened. "Cuisine evolves, madame. We don't cook like they did in the Dark Ages." A few diners at nearby tables glanced over, sensing the tension. "Evolution implies improvement," Margaret replied evenly. "This dish lacks depth, patience, and respect for tradition." She gestured to her plate. "The wine is too young, the mushrooms were barely sautéed, and you've used thyme instead of the traditional bouquet garni." Antoine's face flushed. "With all due respect, madame, I don't think you understand modern cuisine." "Perhaps not," Margaret conceded, "but I understand what makes food memorable. Chef Laurent once told me that a great meal should create a memory that outlasts the evening." She looked directly into Antoine's eyes. "I've carried the memory of his coq au vin for 50 years. I doubt anyone will remember this version by tomorrow." The chef's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I accommodated your special request on our busiest night. I'm sorry if it doesn't match your golden age memories, but we have a full restaurant, and I have real cooking to do." As he turned to leave, Margaret noticed several staff members near the kitchen door laughing. One pantomimed an elderly person with a hunched back. Antoine glanced their way and smirked before heading back to the kitchen. The humiliation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, fighting back tears. This evening meant to honor Thomas, and their life together had become something ugly. She considered simply paying the bill and leaving, but something inside her The same determination that had helped her raise 2 children alone after Thomas died of cancer at 48 wouldn't allow it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. Inside were recipes and notes collected over decades, including detailed descriptions of meals that had meant something to her and Thomas. She flipped to a yellowed page where she'd recorded everything about their engagement dinner. With deliberate calm, Margaret stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Margaret pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, causing an immediate hush to fall over the bustling space. Staff members froze mid-task, shocked by the elderly woman's unexpected appearance in their domain. "Madame, you cannot be in here!" Chef Antoine exclaimed, setting down his knife. "This is a professional kitchen." Margaret stood her ground, ignoring the stares. "I'm aware. I've been in many professional kitchens, including this one." "Security!" Antoine called out, but Margaret raised her hand. "Before you have me removed, you might want to hear what I have to say." She opened her notebook. "You see, after my husband Thomas died, I needed something to fill my days. I took cooking classes. Eventually, I became quite good. Good enough that Henri Laurent himself invited me to apprentice in this very kitchen for a summer." Antoine crossed his arms skeptically. "Henri Laurent has been dead for 15 years. Yes, and he was a dear friend until the end." Margaret's voice remained steady. "He taught me that cooking isn't just about technique. It's about history, memory, and respect." A young sous chef stepped forward. "Wait, are you Margaret Wilson? The Margaret Wilson who wrote Cuisine of Memory?" Antoine's expression shifted. "The cookbook author. I've written several cookbooks," Margaret acknowledged. "But more importantly, I've spent decades documenting the history of this restaurant, including the original coq au vin recipe that Henri perfected. That book changed how I think about food," the sous chef said quietly. "My grandmother gave it to me when I started culinary school." The restaurant's publicist, who had been hovering near the door, stepped forward with recognition dawning in her eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, your Cuisine of Memory won the James Beard Award. Your work on preserving traditional American and French techniques is taught in culinary schools." Margaret nodded modestly. "I simply believe that understanding where we come from helps us know where we're going." She turned back to Antoine. "Chef, I didn't come to your kitchen to embarrass you. I came because 50 years ago, a meal in this restaurant changed my life. I hoped to honor that memory tonight." She carefully tore the page from her notebook and held it out. "This is Henri's original recipe, with his notes. It might interest you to know that he considered coq au vin the true test of a chef's soul. He said anyone could make it, but very few could make it sing." Antoine didn't take the page. His professional pride was visibly battling with the realization of who was standing before him. The publicist looked increasingly alarmed at the situation unfolding in front of staff and several customers who had gathered at the kitchen entrance. "Chef," the publicist whispered urgently, "the Times critic is watching this." Antoine's eyes darted to the dining room, where, indeed, a well-known food critic was observing the scene with great interest. "Perhaps," Margaret suggested gently, "this is an opportunity rather than an embarrassment. Tradition and innovation don't have to be enemies." The kitchen remained in suspended animation as Chef Antoine stared at the recipe in Margaret's outstretched hand. Finally, with a short nod, he accepted the yellowed page. "This is the original?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "Henri's handwriting," Margaret confirmed. "He believed in marinating the chicken for 48 hours and using wine from Burgundy that was at least 5 years old." Antoine studied the notes, his professional curiosity overcoming his pride. These ratios are different from what I was taught." "Because most modern recipes are shortcuts," Margaret explained. Henri understood that certain flavors only develop with time. The food critic had made his way to the kitchen entrance, notepad in hand. Derek, the manager, hovered anxiously nearby, clearly calculating the potential PR disaster or opportunity. Antoine looked up from the recipe, his expression conflicted. Then, in a moment of decision that would later be recounted in culinary circles, he handed the recipe to his sous chef. "Clear my station," he instructed. "We're making this, now." "Chef, the dining room is full," Derek protested. "Then they will wait," Antoine replied firmly. For the next hour, Margaret stood beside Antoine at his station, guiding him through Henri's techniques. She showed him how to properly reduce the sauce, the exact moment to add the pearl onions, and the importance of patience. The kitchen staff watched in fascination as the renowned chef worked alongside the elderly woman, their initial mockery replaced by respect. In the dining room, Derek informed waiting customers about the impromptu masterclass taking place in the kitchen. Far from being annoyed, many were intrigued, particularly when they learned of Margaret's identity. The food critic was documenting everything. When the new dish was finally complete, Antoine carefully plated it and placed it before Margaret at table 17. The dining room had grown quieter as other patrons sensed the significance of the moment. Margaret took a bite and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "That," she said softly, "is Henri's coq au vin." Antoine nodded, a new humility in his expression. "It is different, deeper." He hesitated before adding, "I would be honored if you would allow us to add this version to our menu, as coq au vin Wilson." Margaret smiled. "I think Thomas would have liked that." The moment was interrupted by applause. The food critic had begun clapping, and others joined in. Antoine raised his hand for silence, his face now serious. "I owe Madame Wilson an apology," he announced. "Earlier this evening, my staff and I treated her with disrespect. We laughed at her request and dismissed her knowledge." He looked directly at Margaret. "I was wrong. Tonight, I have been reminded that true cuisine is not just about innovation. It is about honoring the wisdom that came before us." The publicist was practically glowing at this unexpected turn of events, already imagining the headlines. Derek looked relieved, but Margaret was simply remembering Thomas and how he would have handled the situation with the same quiet dignity she had tried to maintain. As Antoine returned to the kitchen, the young couple from the neighboring table approached Margaret. "Excuse me," the woman said shyly. "We just got engaged tonight. Would you mind telling us your story?" The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reading the newspaper. The food critic's review had made the front page of the lifestyle section, "A Lesson in Respect: How an Elderly Patron Transformed Le Maison Blanche." The article praised the restaurant's willingness to embrace its heritage while acknowledging its initial misstep. Margaret's phone had been ringing all morning. Friends, former colleagues, and even a producer from a cooking show. Her granddaughter Emma had texted, "Grandma, you're trending on Twitter." Coq au vin Wilson. The doorbell rang, and Margaret was surprised to find Antoine standing on her porch, holding a professional cooking case. "Chef Antoine," she greeted him. "This is unexpected." "May I come in?" he asked, his usual confidence subdued. Margaret led him to her kitchen, where he set down his case and began unpacking ingredients. "I wanted to thank you properly," he explained, "and to apologize again. What happened last night? It has made me reconsider many things." As he organized his mise en place on her countertop, Antoine continued, "When I was training in Paris, my mentor told me that to be truly great, a chef must be humble enough to learn from anyone. I forgot that lesson." Margaret smiled. "We all forget our lessons sometimes. That's why we need reminders." Together, they spent the morning cooking. Antoine showed Margaret some of his modernist techniques, while she shared stories of cooking alongside Henri and other chefs from that era. They prepared a contemporary version of beef bourguignon, combining his technical precision with her understanding of flavor development. As they worked, Antoine asked about Thomas. "He was an architect," Margaret explained, chopping herbs with practiced skill. He believed buildings should honor their history while serving the present. "Not unlike cooking, really. You must miss him very much." "Every day," Margaret acknowledged. but I've had a good life. 2 wonderful children, 5 grandchildren. I've written books, taught students. I've tried to pass on what I know, just as Henri did for me. After they finished cooking, Antoine insisted on setting the table properly. They sat down to eat together, the unlikely friendship between them growing with each shared story. Le Maison Blanc would be honored if you would consider consulting on our menu, Saint-Étrier, Antoine said as they finished their meal. We're planning a new section called Heritage Classic, featuring dishes that honor the restaurant's history. Margaret considered the offer. I'd like that. On one condition. Name it. Table 17 becomes permanently reserved for special occasions, engagements, anniversaries, reunions, a place where memories can be made and honored. Antoine smiled and extended his hand. Deal. That evening, after Antoine had left, Margaret sat in her living room looking through old photo albums. She found the picture from that night 50 years ago. Thomas beaming beside her at table 17, both of them young and full of dreams. You would have handled it better than I did, she told his photograph. You always knew how to make people see the best in themselves. She closed the album and looked out the window at the setting sun. Tomorrow, she would begin working on her next cookbook, one about the dishes that had marked the milestones of her life. The first recipe would be Henri's coq au vin, followed by Antoine's modern interpretation. Some traditions were worth preserving, Margaret thought, not as museum pieces, but as living lessons that could still speak to those willing to listen. In the kitchen, as in life, the most important ingredient had always been respect, for the past, for others, and for the shared moments that nourished both body and soul.